So let's talk about kind of the different components here. We got our scene view and our game view. This is where we'll kind of navigate our 3D scene and play our game. In the hierarchy, we can actually manage our game objects and kind of select different things in our scene. Down here is our project where we can actually manage our different files, assets, and other things that we've made and kind of drag and drop them to wherever they need to be. You can also organize this into folders, which I just made an example of just there. Next up is the inspector. This is kind of where we will modify values after selecting them in either the hierarchy or our project files. So the first thing we're going to do is actually move around the editor, which we're going to do by holding right click and using WASD to kind of move around our scene. We can also kind of move around our mouse to, of course, move the camera angle. And that's kind of the gist of how you move around our 3D scene. So really quick, as an example of how to kind of create assets, you'll see that we have a scene already made here, but let's go ahead and create a new scene. We can do this by right clicking and then just going to create and then scene. This is basically what would be a game level. Next up, I think we're going to create a cube really quick. So let's go into our hierarchy. If we just right click, we'll see a bunch of different objects like 3D objects, effects, lighting, audio, all these different things that we can use. But for now, I think we're just going to create a cube really quick. So we'll go over back to 3D objects and select a cube. You can also go ahead and move it around, which you'll see very shortly. We'll go into this more in depth later, but for now, you've created your first cube. Really quick, if you are a programmer already and you want to look at the scripting ahead of time, we'll go ahead and show you that if you go up to ZEPETO, in the creation, you can actually make a TypeScript file, and this will be our scripting that will replace standard Unity C# scripting. And additionally, we can go ahead and add this to our game object like we would a normal script. If we go to add component, type ZEPETO script, and then just drag and drop as if it were any other type of script. If you aren't familiar with scripting, no worries, we will cover that in a future video. And since we're on the inspector, let's go ahead and take another couple of few properties here. You'll see that we have all these different things like a box collider where we can kind of change how we physically hit the object. We have a mesh renderer, which is what makes it visible, other different things. And we also have the transform where we can actually manipulate things like the scale, where we can kind of change how large is it, X direction, Y direction, etc. The rotation, and then most importantly probably is going to be the position where we kind of locate it in our world. Another really cool feature is that we can actually adjust the layout of our Unity editor, and we can kind of do this by going to Window, adding these new panels that you'll see right now, or we can go over to the layout section and go ahead and choose a default, which I think we're going to do, and then use the 2x3 is what a lot of our team over here likes to use. And it's kind of what you'll see for the rest of the videos here on out. Everything's still the same though. It's just going to look a little bit different. And we have our scene here on the left. We can actually add a second scene tab if you want. You can have more than one. And we'll do that often if we're making like, a 2D game and we want to see things from different angles. This is especially helpful. Next up, we're going to take a look really quick at the kind of ZEPETO specific Unity features. You'll see that we have published, we kind of talked about this in the last time. You can kind of upload your world doing this just to the world console. It doesn't actually publish your world straight away. We have a server creation tool. If you already have a server, it'll actually start it and start running it. You don't have to do this. We'll talk about this with the module importer video coming up. But if you do want to go ahead and get started working and coding on your server specifically, this is what you would use. Lastly, we also have Play on ZEPETO, which I also showed you. We'll build the QR code and we can kind of use this to test our world. We can also open up our world settings here, in which case we can kind of manipulate our world ID, which you'll need to do before you upload it, change the orientation, max clients, and other ZEPETO unique features. Really quick, I want to go back to talking about how we can move things around our scene. I showed you guys you can move things around with these arrows, but there's also more that you can do. You can also rotate it by clicking on the rotation tool. There's also a hotkey if you'd love to learn the hotkeys for Unity. We can also scale it up and scale it down. And this works especially well because kind of scaling it with just numbers alone can be kind of hard. We can also change our view to be perpendicular with different axes. This is especially useful if you're making a 2D game. We can also change it in and out of perspective mode, which again is also useful if you might be making a 2D game. It's also just really great for map layout if you want that top-down view to kind of see where everything is. And also, if you're having any troubles, a really easy spot to go to kind of maybe fix those problems is if you go to assets, we can actually go to re-import all, which will re-import a lot of the things that may be breaking your project. We can also go to ZEPETO script and then rebuild all, which will rebuild all the scripts in your scene, or internal, which will actually rebuild some of the ZEPETO stuff in your program and hopefully fix any issues you may be facing. Another huge thing that we may want to do is actually update ZEPETO, which we can do by going to Window, Package Manager, and then it should show anything that might need updating. The final thing we're going to go do is actually check out our project settings and our preferences. Preferences will be kind of things to our editor specifically. For example, a thing you might configure here is which IDE you're using. So if you go to external tools, you'll see like Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio Community, whatever you might be using. We can also clear a cache here, which might be useful for lighting issues. But in general, if you want to change something about Unity specifically, this is where you would go to do it. Next up, we're going to go to the project settings, which will actually change settings about your project, the game itself. We have our graphic settings, which if you actually go through the documentation, you'll see that there are some certain settings that you will need to change before uploading it. And there's different build versions. So if you're making a non-ZEPETO game, your iOS builds, Android builds, etc. There's just a bunch of different settings here. Be careful though when working with ZEPETO because not all of it might work exactly how you think about it. And that'll be all for this one.